The snow fell thick and heavy on the town square of Concord, New Hampshire, that bitter January morning in 1878, and Florence Owens stood beside her trunk with ice forming on her eyelashes and shame burning hot in her chest as the man who had sent for her turned his back and walked away without a second glance. She had traveled 3 weeks by train from Boston, clutching the letter that promised her a home, a husband, and a fresh start after the factory fire had left her with no work and no prospects. The letter had been signed by Thomas Granger, a merchant who described himself as a prosperous businessman seeking a wife of good moral character and decent appearance. Florence had responded honestly, sending a photograph taken 2 years prior when she still had money for such luxuries, and describing herself as 22 years old, healthy, capable of keeping house, and willing to work hard to build a life with the right man. But Thomas Granger took one look at her standing there in the snow, travel-worn and exhausted, her dress wrinkled from the journey and her face pale with cold, and announced loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear that she was not what he expected, and he would not honor the arrangement. "You look nothing like your photograph," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I asked for a beauty, not a plain farm girl. I am a man of standing in this community, and I will not be deceived by false representation." Florence wanted to protest that the photograph was truly her, that anyone would look haggard after such a journey, that she had been nothing but honest in all her correspondence. But the words died in her throat as she looked around the town square and saw the faces staring at her. Some showed pity, others curiosity, and still others that particular kind of satisfaction people took in witnessing someone else's humiliation. "Please," she managed to say, hating the tremor in her voice. "I have nowhere else to go. I spent all my money on the train fare. I left everything behind in Boston." Thomas Granger adjusted his expensive coat and looked down his nose at her. "That is hardly my concern. You misrepresented yourself, and I am within my rights to refuse. Good day." He turned and walked toward the general store, leaving Florence standing alone beside her trunk in the increasing snowfall. The crowd began to disperse, people hurrying back to their warm homes and businesses, and Florence felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. She had no money for lodging, no money for a return ticket, and nowhere to go even if she could afford the fare. The factory boarding house in Boston had already rented her bed to someone else. She had burned every bridge when she left, certain that marriage and a new life awaited her. Now she had nothing. She stood there shivering, trying to think of some solution, some way forward, when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "That trunk looks heavy. You planning to stand here holding it all day?" Florence turned to see a tall man watching her with an expression that was hard to read. He wore a heavy coat dusted with snow, worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with lines around his eyes and a strong jaw dark with several days of stubble. He looked to be perhaps 25 or 26, with brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I have nowhere to put it," Florence said, too tired and cold to pretend otherwise. "I came here to marry Mr. Granger, but he has refused me. I heard." The man studied her for a long moment, then looked up at the darkening sky. "Storm is getting worse. You cannot stand out here much longer." "I have no alternative. You do now." He picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing and settled it on his broad shoulder. "She's coming with me." Florence blinked snow from her eyes, not sure she had heard correctly. "What?" "You are coming with me," he repeated, already starting to walk away. "Unless you would rather freeze to death in the town square to prove some point about pride." It was hardly a romantic invitation, but Florence was not in a position to refuse help from anyone. She hurried after him, her feet already numb inside her worn boots, and followed him down the main street and around the corner to where a horse stood waiting, its breath steaming in the cold air. The man secured her trunk behind the saddle with practiced efficiency, then mounted and reached down to her. "Give me your hand." Florence hesitated only a moment before taking his hand and letting him pull her up behind him. She had never ridden a horse before and had to grab his coat to keep from sliding off as he urged the animal into motion. They rode in silence through the falling snow, leaving the town behind and heading into the surrounding countryside. Florence wanted to ask where they were going, what he intended, whether she had just made a terrible mistake by going with a stranger. But the cold stole her breath and made questions impossible. So she held on tight and tried not to think about how completely her life had fallen apart in the space of an hour. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, they arrived at a small ranch house set back from the road. It was a simple structure, weathered wood with a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a steady stream. A barn stood nearby, and Florence could see horses moving in the corral despite the snow. The man dismounted and helped her down, then retrieved her trunk and carried it toward the house. Florence followed on unsteady legs, so cold she could barely feel her feet. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical thing. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and the single large room that made up the main living space was neat and spare, with a table and chairs, a small kitchen area, and a bed in the corner. A loft overhead suggested additional sleeping space. The man set her trunk down and began removing his coat and hat. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. There is a screen over there for privacy and blankets in the chest. Put on whatever you need to get warm." Florence stood dripping on the wooden floor, still trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who are you?" "Jackson Zimmerman. I run this ranch such as it is. About 300 acres, 20 horses, half a dozen cattle." He moved to the fire and began adding more wood. "Not much, but it is mine." "Why did you bring me here?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because Thomas Granger is a fool and you needed help. Are you going to stand there dripping, or are you going to do as I suggested and get warm?" The practical question overrode Florence's confusion. She moved behind the screen and began peeling off her wet dress with trembling fingers. In the chest, she found a heavy wool blanket that she wrapped around herself, trying to stop shaking. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. When she emerged from behind the screen, Jackson was pouring something from a kettle into a tin cup. "Coffee. Drink it." She took the cup in both hands, grateful beyond words for the warmth. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it thawed something inside her chest. Jackson sat down at the table and studied her. "So you came all the way from Boston to marry a man you had never met?" It was not a question, but Florence nodded anyway. "The factory where I worked burned down last fall. 37 girls died. I was lucky to escape with my life, but there was no work to be found after. I had no family, no money, no prospects. When I saw Mr. Granger's advertisement seeking a mail-order bride, it seemed like the answer to my prayers. And instead you found yourself stranded in a snowstorm with a stranger." Jackson's mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile, not much of an answer. "You did not have to help me." "No, I did not." He stood and moved to the kitchen area, pulling out bread and cheese. "But I did, so here we are." "You are hungry, I assume?" Florence was starving, actually, having eaten nothing since the day before. She nodded and watched as Jackson prepared a simple meal with efficient movements. He had the hands of a working man, scarred and calloused, but there was something gentle in the way he moved. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Florence worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "What happens now? You cannot simply keep me here like a stray dog you found in the snow." "Why not?" Jackson met her eyes across the table. "You need a place to stay, and I have space. We are both adults capable of making our own decisions. I am not suggesting anything improper," he added quickly. "You will sleep in the loft. I will sleep down here. But this storm is going to last at least 2 days, and you have nowhere else to go. So you might as well stay until the weather clears and we can figure out what comes next." It was a reasonable suggestion, and Florence had no better alternative. She nodded slowly. "Thank you. I do not know how I will repay your kindness. I am not asking for repayment." Jackson finished his bread and stood. "I need to see to the horses. You should rest. You look dead on your feet." He was right. Now that she was warm and fed, exhaustion crashed over Florence like a wave. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found a narrow bed with clean blankets. She collapsed onto it, still wrapped in the wool blanket, and sleep claimed her immediately. When she woke, it was dark outside and the storm was howling around the house with renewed fury. Florence lay still for a moment, disoriented, before the events of the day came rushing back. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the journey and the cold, and climbed down the ladder. Jackson sat at the table writing in a ledger by the light of an oil lamp. He looked up when she appeared. "There is stew in the pot if you are hungry, and your dress is dry now. I hung it by the fire." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks at the thought of him handling her clothing, but she pushed the embarrassment aside. He had shown her nothing but practical kindness, and she needed to stop acting like a scandalized maiden when he had probably saved her life. She ladled stew into a bowl and sat down across from him. The stew was simple but good, thick with vegetables and meat. "This is delicious. Cooking for one is not much different than cooking for two." Jackson closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. "You said you worked in a factory." "What did you do?" "I was a seamstress. Shirtwaists mostly, but I could sew anything if given a pattern and decent fabric." Florence ate another spoonful of stew. "I was good at it too. The foreman said I was one of his fastest workers." "You have other skills." "I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden. I can read and write and do sums. My mother made sure I had a basic education before she died." Florence met his eyes. "I am a hard worker, Mr. Zimmerman. Whatever you may have heard from Mr. Granger about me being a deceiver, I am honest and capable. I came here in good faith looking for a chance at a decent life." "I believe you." Jackson's voice was quiet but firm. "Thomas Granger is known for his high opinion of himself and his low opinion of everyone else. If you had arrived looking like Helen of Troy, he would have found some other reason to refuse you." The unexpected defense brought tears to Florence's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. She had cried enough for one day. Jackson stood and moved to add wood to the fire. "The storm should clear by tomorrow evening. When it does, you have a decision to make. I can take you back to town and you can try to find work there, or you can stay here." Florence set down her spoon. "Stay here. As what?" "As whatever you want." Jackson turned to face her, his expression serious. "I am not going to lie to you, Miss Owens. This is a lonely life. I have been running this ranch alone for 2 years since my father died. I could use help if you are willing to work. I cannot pay much in the way of wages, but you would have room and board and a safe place to stay while you figure out your next step. You would trust a stranger that much. You trusted me enough to come here." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I am not a rich man like Thomas Granger, and I am not going to pretend to be something I am not. This is a hard life, and winters in New Hampshire are brutal. But I treat people fairly, I pay my debts, and I keep my word. If you stay and work for me, you will be treated with respect." "You have my word on that." Florence looked around the small, neat house and thought about her alternatives. She could return to town and hope to find work, but she had no money and no references. She knew no one and had nowhere to stay. Or she could accept Jackson Zimmerman's offer and at least have a roof over her head while she figured out what to do with her ruined plans. "I will stay," she said. "At least for a while, until I can earn enough money to support myself." "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman." "Jackson," he corrected. "If we are going to be working together, we might as well use first names. And you are Florence, correct?" "Yes, most people call me Flora." "Flora," he nodded. "All right then, Flora, welcome to Zimmerman Ranch." The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of domestic peace as the storm raged outside. Jackson showed Flora around the house, explaining his routines and expectations. She learned that he raised horses primarily, breeding and training them for sale to farmers and ranchers throughout New England. The work was hard and the profit margins thin, but he loved it in a way that was obvious every time he talked about the animals. Flora made herself useful by cooking, mending a pile of clothes that had clearly been neglected for months, and organizing the cluttered kitchen area. Jackson seemed surprised by her initiative but did not object. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and sharing simple meals in the evening. On the second night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Flora worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Why did you never marry, Jackson? A man with property and a trade could easily find a wife." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I was engaged once, 3 years ago. Her name was Margaret. We had known each other since childhood, and everyone assumed we would marry." He stared into the flames, his expression distant. "But when my father got sick and I had to take over the ranch, she decided she did not want the life of a rancher's wife after all. She married a banker from Portsmouth instead. I am sorry. Do not be. She made the right choice for herself. This life is not for everyone." He turned to look at Flora, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "What about you? There must have been someone in Boston." Flora shook her head. "The factory girls did not have much time for courting, and most of the men we met were not the marrying kind. I always thought I would meet someone eventually, but then the fire happened and everything changed." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "When I saw Mr. Granger's advertisement, I thought it was fate, a chance to start over somewhere new. Foolish, I suppose. Not foolish. Hopeful. There is a difference." The simple kindness in his voice made Flora's throat tighten. She stood quickly, not wanting him to see her cry again. "I should get some sleep. Morning comes early on a ranch, I imagine." "Flora." Jackson's voice stopped her at the ladder. "You are not foolish. You are brave. It takes courage to leave everything behind and travel across the country to meet a stranger. Thomas Granger was the fool, not you." Flora nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and climbed to the loft. The storm cleared on the third morning, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow that sparkled blindingly in the winter sun. Jackson bundled up and went out to tend the horses and clear paths through the drifts. Flora watched from the window, impressed by how efficiently he worked despite the brutal conditions. She spent the day baking bread and preparing a proper supper of roasted chicken and vegetables. It felt good to be useful, to have purpose again. The house smelled wonderful when Jackson came in that evening, stamping snow from his boots and pulling off his gloves. "Something smells incredible," he said, his face red from the cold. "It is nothing fancy, but it should be filling." Flora set the food on the table and felt a small glow of satisfaction when Jackson's eyes widened. "This is better than anything I have eaten in months." He sat down and began eating with genuine enthusiasm. "If you keep cooking like this, I am never going to let you leave." The words were said lightly, almost like a joke, but something in Flora's chest tightened at the thought of leaving. In just 3 days, this small house had started to feel more like home than anywhere she had lived in years. Over the next few weeks, Flora settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. She woke early to prepare breakfast while Jackson tended the horses, then spent her days cooking, cleaning, mending, and helping with whatever small tasks she could manage around the property. Jackson taught her to feed the chickens they kept for eggs, how to pump water from the well without freezing the mechanism, and the basics of handling the horses. Flora discovered she liked the animals, especially a gentle mare named Daisy who would nuzzle her hand looking for treats. Jackson seemed pleased by her interest and began teaching her to ride, starting with short trips around the corral and gradually venturing farther afield. They talked while they worked, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Flora learned that Jackson had grown up on the ranch, the only child of parents who had died within a year of each other, leaving him alone with the property and a mountain of debt he was slowly paying down. He spoke of wanting to expand the breeding operation, of building a real barn to replace the aging structure that currently housed the horses, of maybe someday having a family to fill the too-quiet house. Flora shared her own history, the loneliness of growing up without siblings after her mother died, and her father worked himself into an early grave. She talked about the factory, about the friends she had lost in the fire, about the guilt she still carried for surviving when so many others had not. "You cannot blame yourself for living," Jackson said one evening as they sat by the fire. "You honor their memory by making the most of the life you were given." "Is that what I am doing here?" Flora asked softly. "Making the most of things." Jackson looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "I hope so. I hope you are starting to see this as more than just a place to stay until something better comes along." "It has been a long time since I felt like I belonged anywhere," Flora admitted. "But here, with you, it almost feels like I could." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jackson reached across the space that separated them and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm against hers. "You do belong here, Flora. If you want to stay, not as hired help but as something more, I would be honored." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know I am not the husband you pictured when you came to New Hampshire, but I care about you, more than I thought possible in such a short time, and I think, if you are honest, you might feel the same way." Flora's heart hammered in her chest. She did feel something for Jackson, something that had grown from gratitude into affection, and was rapidly becoming something deeper. He was kind and hardworking and honest in ways that made her feel safe. When he smiled at her across the dinner table, or praised her cooking, or taught her something new about the horses, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I do feel the same way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting we do what you came here to do in the first place. I am suggesting we get married." Jackson squeezed her hand gently. "I know it is fast, and I know I should probably court you properly first. But we are already living together, already working together, already building something together. Why not make it official? You want to marry me?" Flora could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Yes," Jackson's voice was firm and certain. "I want to marry you, Flora Owens. I want to build a life with you, raise horses with you, maybe have children with you someday if we are blessed. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are here and go to sleep every night with you beside me. So yes, I want to marry you. The question is whether you want to marry me." Flora looked into his honest face and thought about how different he was from Thomas Granger, who had judged her on appearance and found her wanting. Jackson had taken her in when she had nothing, treated her with respect and kindness, and now offered her everything she had been seeking when she left Boston: a home, a partnership, a future. "Yes," she said, feeling certainty settle into her bones. "Yes, Jackson, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close, and Flora felt tears slip down her cheeks. But these were not tears of shame or sorrow like those she had cried in the town square. These were tears of relief and joy and gratitude for the unexpected gift of this good man, and this new chance at happiness. They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Concord. Jackson wore his best suit, carefully pressed, and Flora wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Jackson had purchased in town, cream-colored wool with pearl buttons. They had no guests except the minister and his wife, who served as witnesses, but Flora did not mind. This was not a marriage for show or social standing. This was a covenant between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and chosen to build something together. When Jackson kissed her at the end of the ceremony, gentle and sweet, Flora felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer a rejected mail-order bride or a charity case. She was Florence Zimmerman, wife and partner and equal. She was home. Their wedding night was tender and somewhat awkward, as first times often are, but there was genuine affection and care in every touch. Jackson was patient and gentle, and Flora felt her initial nervousness give way to something warmer and more intimate. Afterward, they lay together in the bed that had been his alone for so long, and Flora rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "No regrets?" Jackson asked softly, his fingers running through her hair. "None." Flora lifted her head to look at him. "You saved my life that day in the town square, Jackson, not just from freezing, but from giving up entirely. I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." "You saved mine too," he said. "I just did not realize I needed saving until you were here." The winter passed in a rhythm of work and growing intimacy. Flora truly became a partner in running the ranch, learning everything Jackson would teach her about the horses and the business. She discovered she had a good eye for evaluating animals and a gentle touch that the horses responded to. Jackson began consulting her on decisions about which horses to keep for breeding and which to sell. In town, people talked, of course. The story of how Jackson Zimmerman had claimed the rejected mail-order bride spread quickly, and opinions were divided. Some thought it romantic, others scandalous, and still others considered it proof that Jackson had always been eccentric. But neither Jackson nor Flora cared what the gossip said. They were too busy building their life together. Thomas Granger, they heard through the town grapevine, had sent away for another mail-order bride who arrived, took one look at him, and refused to marry him, leaving on the next train before he could protest. The poetic justice of it made Flora laugh until tears ran down her face. "Perhaps he will learn something from the experience," Jackson said, though he sounded doubtful. "Perhaps," Flora agreed. "Or perhaps he will just blame the women and learn nothing at all." Spring came late to New Hampshire, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world. The snow melted, revealing the land beneath, and green shoots began pushing up through the brown earth. Flora planted a garden, carefully tending the seeds she coaxed into life, and watched with satisfaction as the neat rows began to flourish. The horses foaled that spring, and Flora helped Jackson with the deliveries, marveling at the gangly-legged miracles that wobbled into the world. She bottle-fed a weak colt that the mother rejected, staying up through the night to give him nourishment every few hours, and cried with relief when he finally grew strong enough to run with the others. "You have a gift with them," Jackson said, watching her work with the young horses. "They trust you." "I think they know I care," Flora replied, stroking the colt's velvet nose. Animals can always tell. By summer, the ranch was thriving in ways it had not for years. With Flora's help, Jackson was able to expand his operation, taking on more horses and commanding better prices for the well-trained animals he sold. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, exhausted but satisfied at the end of each day. And at night, they explored the growing passion between them, learning each other's bodies and desires with increasing confidence and joy. Flora had not expected physical intimacy to be something she would crave, but Jackson's touch had awakened something in her that demanded satisfaction. He seemed equally enthralled, reaching for her each night with hands that trembled slightly and eyes dark with desire. One evening in late July, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of lovemaking, Jackson propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at her with unusual seriousness. "I love you, Flora Zimmerman," he said. "I should have said it before now, but I wanted to be sure you knew I meant it. Not just affection or appreciation or partnership, though those are all part of it. Real love, the kind that lasts." Flora felt her eyes fill with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Jackson, so much it frightens me sometimes." "Why does it frighten you?" "Because I could lose you. Because happiness this complete feels too fragile to last." She touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I lost everything once before. I am terrified of losing you." Jackson captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You are not going to lose me. I am not going anywhere. We are going to grow old together on this ranch, Flora. We are going to fill this house with children and raise them to be strong and kind. We are going to build something that lasts." "Promise?" "I promise." And he kept that promise. In September, Flora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be certain before she said anything. When she finally told Jackson over breakfast one morning, he stared at her for a long moment, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "A baby." His voice cracked slightly on the word. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes." Flora could not help grinning at his stunned expression. "Next spring, if I have calculated correctly. April or May." Jackson set down his coffee cup very carefully, then crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "We are going to have a baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Flora, we are going to be parents," she laughed, dizzy from spinning and from happiness. "I know, are you pleased?" "Pleased. I am the happiest man in New Hampshire, in all of New England, in the entire country." He set her down gently, suddenly cautious. "Should you be working so hard? Do you need to rest more? Is there anything I can do?" "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Flora said, amused by his concern. "I can still work. The baby is barely the size of a bean right now." But despite her protests, Jackson insisted on taking over the heavier tasks and making sure she rested more. He cooked dinners and fussed over her in ways that were both endearing and occasionally irritating. Flora bore it with good humor, knowing his concern came from love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into another New Hampshire winter. As Flora's belly grew round and full, Jackson built a cradle from oak wood, carefully sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk. Flora sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small the garments were. They talked endlessly about the baby, about what to name it and how to raise it, and what kind of person they hoped it would become. Jackson wanted to teach their child to ride almost before it could walk. Flora wanted to make sure it learned to read and appreciate books. They both agreed that kindness and honesty were the most important virtues they could instill. "Boy or girl, it does not matter," Jackson said one evening, his hand resting on Flora's swollen belly, "as long as it is healthy." "And loved," Flora added, "as long as it is loved." That is guaranteed. The baby came on a warm morning in late April, arriving with the spring flowers and the new foals. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the midwife from town, and there were moments when Flora wondered if she would survive it. But Jackson never left her side, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths and telling her how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her. And finally, after 18 hours of struggle, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to anyone within a mile. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the red-faced, squalling infant on Flora's chest. "A big, healthy boy." Flora looked down at her son, at his tiny fingers and his screwed-up face and his shock of dark hair, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one, we have been waiting for you." Jackson touched the baby's head with one tentative finger, his face full of awe. "He is perfect. Flora, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel Jackson Zimmerman, and he was indeed perfect. He nursed vigorously and slept in reasonable stretches, and seemed content to be passed between his parents as they went about their work. Jackson wore him in a sling Flora fashioned, carrying their son while he worked with the horses, and Daniel seemed to find the movement soothing. Flora recovered from the birth more quickly than the midwife expected, and soon she was back to her usual routines, though now with a baby on her hip or sleeping in the cradle Jackson had made. She found that motherhood came naturally to her, as did the fierce protective love that made her understand, for the first time, why mothers would do anything to keep their children safe. The years that followed were full and rich. Daniel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quick smile. Flora gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Lily when Daniel was 3, and another son named Thomas when Lily was 2. The house that had seemed so quiet when Flora first arrived was now filled with noise and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of family life. Jackson expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjacent property when the opportunity arose and building the new barn he had always wanted. Flora managed the household and helped with the horses when she could find time between caring for the children. They hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work, paying him a fair wage and treating him well, and he stayed for years, becoming almost part of the family. The ranch prospered. Jackson's reputation for breeding and training quality horses spread throughout New England, and buyers came from as far as Connecticut and Vermont to purchase his animals. The money was not extravagant, but it was steady, and they were able to save enough to feel secure. In town, people stopped gossiping about the rejected mail-order bride who had married the eccentric rancher. Flora made friends among the other ranch wives, women who understood the demands of the life and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. She joined the church sewing circle and contributed to community events, gradually becoming a respected member of the community rather than an outsider. Thomas Granger, they heard, had eventually married a woman from Boston with family money. The marriage was reportedly unhappy, which gave Flora a small, shameful sense of satisfaction she tried hard not to indulge. She had long since forgiven him for rejecting her, realizing that his cruelty had been the catalyst for the best thing that ever happened to her. Without his rejection, she never would have married Jackson. On a winter evening 12 years after that fateful day in the town square, Flora stood at the window watching her children play in the snow while Jackson worked in the barn. Daniel was 14 now, tall and strong, already helping his father with the horses in meaningful ways. Lily was 11, bright and curious, always asking questions and demanding answers. Thomas was 9, the quietest of the 3, with a gift for gentle patience that served him well with the animals, Flora rested her hand on her belly, feeling the flutter of the new life growing there. She had not yet told Jackson about this fourth pregnancy, waiting to be certain. But she was certain now, and tonight she would share the news. She thought about the frightened, desperate woman she had been all those years ago, standing alone in the snow with nowhere to go and no one to help her. She thought about how close she had come to giving up entirely, and how Jackson's simple act of kindness had changed everything. The door opened and Jackson came in, stamping snow from his boots. He looked up and caught her watching him, and his face broke into the smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, crossing to her and pulling her into his arms. "I was thinking about how grateful I am," Flora said, leaning into his embrace. "For you, for our children, for this life we have built together. Even though it is not the life you imagined when you left Boston, especially because it is not the life I imagined." She pulled back to look at him. "What I imagined was surviving. What we have is so much better than that. We have thrived, Jackson, together." He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "Yes, we have, and we are going to keep thriving for many more years to come." "About that," Flora said, taking his hand and placing it on her belly, "we are going to need a bigger table." It took Jackson a moment to understand, and then his eyes widened. Another baby! Another baby! His whoop of joy brought the children running in from outside, demanding to know what the excitement was about. When they learned they would have a new brother or sister, Daniel grinned and Lily clapped, and Thomas asked, very seriously, if he could help take care of it. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Jackson and Flora lay together in the darkness, his hand resting on her belly. "Did you ever imagine we would be here?" Flora asked softly. "That day when you told me to come with you, honestly?" "No." Jackson's voice was quiet. "I just knew I could not leave you standing there in the snow. Everything after that has been the greatest surprise of my life. A good surprise, I hope. The best surprise. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Flora Zimmerman. You and our children and the life we share." Flora turned in his arms, needing to see his face in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "I love you, Jackson, more than I could ever put into words. I love you too, always." They fell asleep holding each other, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. And that together they could handle anything. The fourth baby, another daughter they named Rose, arrived healthy and strong the following summer. She had Flora's auburn hair and Jackson's stubborn chin, and from the moment she entered the world, she made her presence known with volume and determination. The older children doted on her, and she grew up confident and fearless, the baby of the family but never willing to be left behind when her siblings went exploring. Years continued to pass in the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew and learned, and eventually began making their own ways in the world. Daniel took over more and more of the horse training, showing a natural talent that surpassed even his father's. Lily married a teacher from Concord and moved into town but visited often, bringing her own children to run wild on the ranch. Thomas became a veterinarian, studying in Boston before returning to New Hampshire to practice, and he lived in the house Jackson built for him on the far edge of the property. Rose, spirited and independent, shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to go west to California. And though Flora worried, she and Jackson gave their blessing and the money for her journey. Through it all, Jackson and Flora remained each other's constants. They worked together, raised their children together, navigated the challenges and celebrated the triumphs together. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration or hurt feelings, but they always came back to the foundation of love and respect that had sustained them from the beginning. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Flora back to the town square in Concord. It was a warm summer day, nothing like the bitter winter storm of their first meeting, and the square was full of people going about their business. "Why did you bring me here?" Flora asked, bemused. Jackson led her to the spot where she had stood that long-ago day, rejected and alone. "Because this is where it started, where I first saw you and knew I could not walk away." "You did not know anything of the sort," Flora protested, laughing. "You thought I was a charity case who needed help, maybe at first." Jackson turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "But even then, something in me recognized you. Recognized that you were important, that you mattered, that you would change my life if I let you." "And did I change your life?" "You became my life," Jackson said simply. "Everything good I have, everything I am, is because you were brave enough to get on that horse and come home with me." Flora felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears for all the years they had shared and all the years still to come. "I got on that horse because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because I fell in love with a good man who treated me like I was worth something." "You are worth everything," Jackson said, and kissed her there in the town square, in the exact spot where their story had begun. People stared, but neither of them cared. They had never cared what people thought, only what they knew to be true. And what they knew was that love could come from the most unexpected places, could bloom in the midst of despair, could transform two lonely people into a family, a partnership, a forever. They lived many more years together, watching their children and grandchildren grow, continuing to work the ranch even as age slowed their steps and silvered their hair. Flora never stopped being grateful for the day Thomas Granger rejected her, because that rejection had led her to Jackson. And Jackson never stopped being grateful that he had been in town that particular day, at that particular moment, to see a woman standing alone in the snow and make the decision that changed both their lives. When they were very old, sitting on the porch of the ranch house they had shared for nearly 50 years, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Flora squeezed Jackson's hand and said, "Thank you." "For what?" he asked, his voice rough with age but still warm with love. "For seeing me that day, for bringing me home, for loving me." Jackson brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for building this life with me." "I would do it all again," Flora said. "Every single moment, exactly the same. Even the part where Granger humiliated you in front of the whole town, especially that part," Flora said firmly, "because it brought me to you." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had started as strangers and become each other's everything. Their love story had begun in the most unlikely way, with rejection and rescue, and a simple act of kindness offered by a cowboy to a woman in need. But it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of compassion and courage in choosing to love even when the odds seemed impossible. They had built a legacy together, not just in the ranch they had nurtured and the children they had raised, but in the example they set of what marriage could be at its best. A true partnership of equals, bound by love and sustained by respect, and made joyful by genuine affection. And when Jackson died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, Flora held his hand and whispered all the things she wanted him to carry with him. How much she loved him, how grateful she was, how he had been the best husband, the best father, the best man she had ever known. She told him she would see him again someday, in whatever came after this life, and that she would love him there too, just as she had loved him here. She lived another 3 years without him, surrounded by children and grandchildren who cared for her as tenderly as she had once cared for them. And when her own time came, she went peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she had lived a life rich with love and purpose. Her children buried her beside Jackson on the hill, overlooking the ranch they had built together, under a simple stone that bore both their names and a single word that said everything that needed to be said. Together. Because that was what they had been, from that snowy day in the town square until the very end. Together in work and in love, in struggle and in triumph, in building something that would outlast them both. They had been two people rejected by others and rescued by each other, who had found in partnership something neither could have achieved alone. Their story became legend in Concord, told and retold over generations. The tale of the mail-order bride refused in the town square, and the cowboy who stepped forward and said she was coming with him. Some versions romanticized it, adding details that never happened. Others got the facts wrong, confusing names or dates or circumstances. But the heart of the story remained true. That love could come from unexpected places, that kindness could change a life, and that sometimes the best things happened when plans fell apart and forced you onto a new path entirely. The ranch continued for another generation under Daniel's management, then passed to his son, then to his grandson. Each generation added their own touches, but they all maintained the foundation Jackson and Flora had built. The house was enlarged and modernized, but the core structure remained, and the stone fireplace where Jackson and Flora had shared so many quiet evenings still stood at its heart. And on cold winter nights, when snow fell heavy and thick just as it had that long ago January day, the family would gather by that fireplace and tell the story again. The story of how it all began, how their family came to be, how a woman's worst day became the beginning of her greatest joy. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down. Because it reminded them that rejection was not the end, that despair could transform into hope, and that sometimes the person who saved you was someone you never expected, appearing at exactly the moment you needed them most. It reminded them that love was a choice, made again and again, in big ways and small. That family was built not just by blood but by commitment and care and showing up for each other day after day, year after year. And it reminded them that every family had to start somewhere, with two people brave enough to take a chance on each other, despite everything working against them. Two people who chose love when it would have been easier to walk away. Two people who built something lasting from the rubble of broken plans and shattered expectations. Jackson and Flora Zimmerman had been those people, and their legacy lived on in every child and grandchild and great-grandchild who carried their names and their values forward into the future. They had started with nothing but each other, and from that foundation, they had built an empire of love that would endure long after they were gone. Their story proved that the most beautiful things in life often came from the most difficult moments, that rescue could arrive in unexpected forms, and that saying yes to love, even when it was risky and uncertain and completely different from what you planned, was always worth it in the end. And so the story continued, passed from generation to generation. A reminder that sometimes the best love stories started not with love at first sight, but with simple human kindness offered to a stranger in need. That sometimes the right person appeared not when you were looking for them, but when you had lost all hope of finding them. And that sometimes the words that changed your life forever were as simple as "She's coming with me," spoken by a cowboy in a snowstorm who could not walk away from someone who needed help. It was a good story, a true story, a love story for the ages. And it all began in the town square of Concord, New Hampshire, on a bitter January day in 1878, when Florence Owens stood alone and abandoned, and Jackson Zimmerman chose compassion over indifference. From that single choice, everything else had flowed. From that moment, two lives had intertwined and become one, and that, really, was what love was all about. Two separate people choosing to become something greater together. Choosing each other, again and again, in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them, and then beyond, into whatever came next. Jackson and Flora Zimmerman had chosen each other that day in the snow, and they had kept choosing each other every day after for the rest of their lives. And that was a gift beyond measure, a blessing beyond words, a love story that proved some things really did last forever. The end.